By the first week of May 2019, there were cattle standing in a field that everyone in Shelby County, Illinois, knew was supposed to become corn. That was the scandal, not weeds, not a failed spray pass, not a landlord dispute. Cattle on black row crop ground. To the men who slowed their pickups along County Road 18, it looked like a farmer had confused the most valuable acres he had with a sacrifice lot. The calves were clipping a thick green stand of rye, oats, and clover on a 92-acre field that should have been brown, clean, and ready for a planter. Instead, the place moved in the wind like hay ground. And in that part of Illinois, hay ground was not what serious corn looked like. By lunch, the story had reached the seed counter in Shelbyville. By supper, it had grown teeth. Mason Reddick had finally gone full grass farmer. Mason was feeding steers where corn was supposed to pay rent. Mason had let a pasture idea crawl into row crop country and take over his judgment. The line that stuck came from Roy Sutter, who farmed across the road and had never met a new idea he could not make smaller. "He's going to plant corn into a cow lot," Roy said. Everybody laughed because it sounded complete. That was the county's favorite kind of sentence. It did not explain anything. It did not need to. It gave everyone permission to stop thinking. Mason heard the line 2 days later at the parts counter. He did not argue. He bought a hydraulic hose, signed the ticket, and drove back to the East Bend field, where the calves had already been moved to the next strip, and the ground behind them did not look ruined. It looked covered. That was the part people kept missing. Mason Reddick was 46 that spring, broad-shouldered, patient, and quiet in a way that made talkative men suspicious. He farmed corn and soybeans outside Windsor on owned ground, rented ground, and a few awkward fields his father had kept because selling land felt like giving away a sentence before it was finished. He also ran a small group of stalkers on a rougher tract near the timber, not because he was sentimental about cattle, but because he had learned that animals noticed things machinery could not. He was not trying to turn Shelby County back into open pasture. He was trying to make one tired cornfield breathe again. The East Bend was the field that made him think that way. 92 acres wrapped around a shallow drainage, with a high shoulder on the south side, a flat middle that crusted after hard rains, and a lower edge that could be too wet in April and too hard by July. The field had once been mixed ground in his grandfather's time. A few cows, a little hay, a fence line that had since been buried under confidence. By the early 1990s, the fence was gone. The low spot had been shaped. The field was fully tile-mapped and folded into the rotation like everything else. For years it behaved well enough. Then it began to behave expensively. Not catastrophically. That would have been easier. Catastrophe at least gives a farmer a clear enemy. The East Bend failed in the more insulting way. It accepted more management and gave back less gratitude. A higher population made the good strips look impressive and made the high shoulder punish itself faster. More nitrogen helped the parts that could still use it and sat awkwardly where the ground had no structure left to hold the conversation. Fungicide kept the camera-friendly sections pretty. The weak zones stayed weak. After a 2-inch rain, the middle sealed. After 10 dry days, the top 2 inches turned mean. Roots met a ceiling where Mason knew there should have been a doorway. By 2017, he had stopped calling the problem fertility. Fertility was part of it, sure. Fertility is always part of the argument, if you ask enough salesmen. But Mason could dig. He could watch water bead on a surface that should have accepted it. He could pull a corn plant in August and see roots that had taken one look at the hard layer and chosen sideways over downward. He could stand there after rain and feel the field close itself. The East Bend did not need another product first. It needed an old function back. That idea started on a smaller, uglier farm 10 miles away. Mason had seeded cereal rye behind beans, then added oats and clover the next fall, mostly because seed was cheap that year, and he wanted a cover thick enough to matter. In April, instead of terminating it immediately, he turned stockers on it for a short graze, moving them with temporary wire before the ground got sloppy. They ate hard. They trampled enough residue down to armor the surface. They left manure in small, useful deposits, instead of in a winter lot where it had to be hauled back out like regret. Then Mason killed the stand and planted corn later than the calendar liked. The result did not win the county. It did something more useful. It behaved differently under stress. The next year the soil stayed cooler. Water disappeared into it, instead of running off in little brown sheets. The corn roots found old root channels. The field looked less dramatic from the road and more competent under a shovel. Mason did not call it regenerative. He did not call it a movement. He did not post a sunset photo and write a sermon under it. He wrote down dates, stalking pressure, moisture, residue cover, stand count, infiltration time, and what the roots looked like when nobody was watching. Then he decided to try the sequence on the East Bend. That was the decision Shelby County decided was funny. The previous fall, after soybeans came off, Mason drilled a mix that would make any clean field loyalist uneasy. Cereal rye for the spine, oats for early mass, crimson clover for a little nitrogen and spring life, a small amount of radish to punch and rot before winter. It was not a permanent pasture. It was not a surrender. It was a temporary living tool placed in front of corn. By March, the field was greener than anything around it. By April, it had become impossible to ignore. A serious cornfield, according to local taste, should approach planting season with a kind of disciplined emptiness. The East Bend approached it with movement, green leaves bending, damp residue underneath, root mass holding the surface together. The shallow drainage no longer looked like a wound. The south shoulder, usually bare enough to warm quickly and crust even quicker, was under a living mat. Roy Sutter slowed down every morning on his way to check cows at his brother-in-law's place. At first, he only looked. Then he started waving with the exaggerated cheer of a man already preparing his future. "I told you so." Finally, one evening, he pulled into Mason's lane. "You really putting corn behind that jungle?" Mason leaned against the gate post. "That's the plan." Roy looked across the green field and shook his head. "You know, there's still time to spray it and act normal." "I know. You turn cattle out there, you'll mash it into soup." "Not if I move them right." Roy smiled as if Mason had just proved the point. "Corn doesn't pay extra for hoof prints." Mason looked at the field, then at the temporary fence reels stacked in his truck bed. "No," he said, "but it does charge for a field that can't take water." The cattle went on the East Bend on April 23rd. Not for long. Not loose. Not the way the county imagined it. Mason broke the field into narrow strips, moved water carefully, and watched the weather with the obsessive attention of a man who knew one wrong wet day could turn a good idea into the exact disaster his neighbors wanted to see. The calves hit the forage hard. The stand went from knee-high confidence to a pressed, broken, useful surface. Leaves clipped, stems cracked, manure dotted the ground. Hooves tucked residue into contact with soil without leaving the field raw. From the road, it looked like chaos. Underfoot, it was timing. Mason pulled the cattle before the next rain. He let the field rest just enough. Then he terminated the cover and planted corn later than almost everyone around him. Not recklessly late, but late enough for coffee shop certainty to feel safe. The jokes returned stronger. Roy called it pasture corn. Someone at the co-op upgraded that to feedlot corn. A young seed salesman from Decatur, trying to sound older than he was, said Mason had created the most expensive grazing paddock in the township. The phrase got repeated because it allowed men with clean seedbeds to feel like they had already won. Ben Hargrave, Mason's crop consultant, came out at V4 with a soil probe, a clipboard, and the careful expression of someone who wants a client to feel respected while still being warned. The stand was decent. That was all Mason would give it, and all Ben would allow. Decent. Not a showpiece, not early, not as even on the high shoulder as Mason wanted. Residue was thick in places. A few hoof impressions remained visible along one strip, where the calves had pressed harder near water. Ben pointed with the probe. "That lane is going to haunt you in July." Mason said, "Maybe." "You can't ask corn to overcome cattle damage." "I'm not asking it to overcome cattle damage." Ben looked at him. Mason kicked aside a layer of residue and showed him the soil below it. Darker, crumbed, cooler, still holding dampness from a rain that had already left the bare fields. "I'm asking it to use what the cattle helped leave behind." Ben did not laugh. That mattered. Professionals learn to laugh less than neighbors because they are paid to be surprised more carefully. Still, he wrote down concerns. Late planting, heavy cover, uneven strip pressure, possible nitrogen tie-up, cooler soil, residue interference, compaction risk. Every concern was real. That was why the county's joke was so lazy. It had taken a risky sequence and reduced it to a cartoon. Mason never claimed the system was safe. He claimed the field was already in danger, and the danger everyone accepted had become invisible because it was familiar. May did not settle the argument. Neither did June. For most of June, Shelby County looked confident. Corn on the cleaner fields leapt first, as it usually does. Rows closed. Side dress rigs ran. The good black dirt made everybody's opinion feel well supported. The East Bend looked respectable but not spectacular. From a pickup window at 40 miles an hour, Roy's corn looked ahead. Roy made sure people noticed. By the second week of June, he had started using the phrase, "Mason's cow field." With the satisfaction of a man watering a plant he expected to harvest later. Mason did not fight the phrase. He was too busy digging. Under the residue, the East Bend was not acting like it used to. The middle was not sealing into that flat gray plate after rain. The lower edge, normally a quick switch from sticky to concrete, stayed more forgiving. The south shoulder still worried him, but the roots were going down with a seriousness he had not seen there in years. One afternoon, After a hard half-inch shower, Mason drove to the East Bend, then to a cleaner rented field nearby. On the clean field, water had moved across the surface and cut tiny paths through loose soil. On the East Bend, most of the rain had vanished downward. Mason stood there in the wet residue and wrote one sentence in his notebook. The field took the drink. He did not know yet how important that sentence would become. July arrived without drama at first. That is how bad months often enter farm country. Not with a sign, not with thunder, just fewer chances to recover. The rain began missing by narrow margins. Storms built, split, and walked around Shelby County like they had somewhere better to be. Afternoons sharpened. The wind came dry. Nights stayed too warm. Corn that had looked invincible in June started using water faster than the soil could replace it. By the middle of July, the high shoulders around the county began to change color. Not all at once, not enough for outsiders. Enough for farmers. Leaves rolled by noon. Lower leaves fired along lighter ground. Field edges lost that deep, boastful green and took on the tired look of a crop doing math it did not like. Men kept saying they were one rain away, because that is the last hopeful sentence before arithmetic becomes public. The East Bend should have suffered early. That was the entire point of the county's confidence. It had the later planting date. It had the cattle story attached to it. It had a high shoulder with a long memory of giving up too soon. It had residue that was supposed to keep soil too cool in spring, and hoof marks that were supposed to punish roots in summer. Instead, the field held. Not perfectly. Perfect would have made the story suspicious. The East Bend still showed stress on the lighter knobs. It still had weak spots where history could not be erased in one season. It was not magic, and Mason would have been embarrassed by anyone who said it was. But it did not collapse in the old pattern. The corn stayed open later into the day. The soil under the residue was cooler to the hand. The surface did not bake into a lid. The lower edge, where the county expected hoof pressure to become a punchline, stayed alive enough to surprise even Mason. When a scattered storm finally gave the neighborhood 6/10 of an inch, the East Bend used it. That was the difference. Other fields received rain. The East Bend used rain. Roy noticed from his kitchen window before he admitted it from his mouth. His own field across the road had the cleaner start, the earlier planting date, and the confidence of every local habit behind it. But the south-facing shoulder was yellowing faster than he wanted to say. Across the road, Mason's mocked field did not have the best corn in the township. It had something more irritating. It had steadiness. One evening, Roy drove over and stopped at the edge of the field. Mason was there with a spade, because by then, every person who wanted to talk about the East Bend found him holding either a spade or a notebook. Roy did not get out right away. Finally, he opened the door and said, "Did this side catch more rain?" "No." Roy looked down the rows. "Then why isn't it folding like mine?" Mason pushed the spade into the ground and lifted a block of soil threaded with roots. "Because it didn't enter July naked." Roy frowned. "That's supposed to mean something?" "It means the field had cover. Roots, armor, channels, shade at the surface, a little manure where life could use it. It had more ways to handle a bad week." Roy looked away because the answer was too clean to mock, and too annoying to accept. You saying cows saved your corn? Mason shook his head. No. I'm saying the sequence helped the field stay in the fight. That was the answer most people did not want. A trick would have been easier. A trick can be copied without humility. A trick can be mocked, then stolen, then renamed. But Mason's system was not a trick. It was a sequence, and sequences are less convenient because timing matters. Living cover mattered. So did grazing pressure. So did moisture. So did pulling the cattle off before the field lost structure. So did residue. So did termination timing. So did the planter setup. So did patience with the ugly part before the proof arrived. The county wanted one object to blame or worship. The field answered as a system. Ben Hargrave returned in late July, this time without the cautious smile. He walked the high shoulder with Mason, dug 3 holes, checked root depth, peeled back residue, and measured soil temperature against a bare strip near the lane. He was quiet long enough that Mason finally said, "Still worried about the hoof prints?" Ben stood and brushed soil from his hands. "Yes," he said, "but I'm more worried that we've been calling the wrong thing safe." That sentence traveled farther than any joke Roy had made. By August, the county had stopped laughing. The dry spell did not destroy every field, but it revealed every field. That is what stress does in farm country. It removes politeness. It shows who has structure and who has only appearance. Some deep black fields still carried the season well. Some low ground held because water had stayed where it was needed. But the lighter rolling acres, the exact kind of acres that had looked fine in June, began telling a harsher truth. The East Bend became uncomfortable to drive past, not because it was the best, because it should not have been that good. Farmers who had laughed in May now slowed down with the serious face people use when they are gathering information without wanting to be seen asking for it. A landlord from near Strasburg called Mason and asked whether the cattle had packed it up too bad. Mason told him no. A younger tenant asked if the system would work without owning cattle. Mason said maybe, with the right arrangement and the right field, but not if he was only chasing a story. That answer disappointed people. They wanted a recipe now. They had mocked the thing when it looked risky and wanted it simplified once it looked useful. Mason refused to make it simple. He told them the East Bend had been losing the same summer argument for years. The cover and cattle had not made the field rich overnight. They had changed the terms of the argument. They gave the surface armor. They put roots in before corn roots arrived. They fed biology when the field would normally sit bare. They made water enter instead of run. They cooled the ground when July tried to turn it into a skillet. They gave the field lungs. That became Mason's private phrase. Not a slogan. He would have hated that. Just a way to remember what the work was really about. For 30 years, the East Bend had been treated like a machine that only needed inputs and weather. Mason had started to see it more like a body with a breathing problem. The county kept offering it stronger coffee. Mason had tried to open its lungs. Harvest settled what summer had already hinted. The East Bend did not top Mason's farm average. It did not beat his best bottom field. It did not turn into an advertisement with a clean yield map and a man smiling too hard beside a combine. The lower edge still had scars. The south shoulder still cost him bushels. A one-year sequence could not reverse decades of simplification, but against its own history, and against the kind of nearby rolling ground that July had punished, it came off startlingly strong. The field that was supposed to be feedlot corn beat the estimate Mason had written privately in June. It beat Roy's field across the road by enough that nobody could explain it away with one combine calibration joke. The high shoulder, normally the first place to quit, held better than Mason had seen in a dry finish. The middle, once known for crusting and sulking, carried a more even stand to the end. 3 days after Roy finished harvest, he drove into Mason's shop yard and stood with his thumbs hooked in his pockets while grain dust moved through the late light. "I still think it looked stupid in May," Roy said. Mason nodded. "It did." Roy squinted toward the road. "But it didn't hurt the corn." "No." Roy waited a long time before giving the season its proper shape. Might have kept it from hurting itself. Mason looked at him. "That's closer." That winter, Ben Hargrave spoke at a soil meeting in Decatur and chose his words carefully. He did not sell the system as a miracle. He did not tell every farmer to turn calves onto corn ground. He used all the correct phrases. Site-specific, weather-dependent, management-heavy, not for every acre, easy to get wrong. All true. Then he put up a slide from the East Bend, not a beauty shot, a soil photo. Roots following old channels, residue protecting the surface. A side-by-side temperature reading taken in late July. A yield map with the high shoulder marked. The room knew whose field it was before Ben said the name. He never called it feedlot corn. He did not have to. The county had retired that joke on its own. The next spring, not much changed in the loud way outsiders expect. There was no revolution, no parade of cattle through row crop country, no county-wide confession. Farmers are rarely converted in public. They adjust in private, then later describe the adjustment as something they had been considering all along. One man seeded rye thicker behind beans and asked about custom grazing. Another repaired an old water point near a field edge. A landlord who had complained about messy covers asked whether residue might help a hill farm that always burned up in August. Roy bought 2 reels of temporary fence and told anyone who noticed that he had been meaning to experiment anyway. Mason let him have that. Pride, like soil, changes best when it is not left bare. Years later, when people talked about the summer of 2019, they remembered how quickly the confidence faded. They remembered the curled leaves, the warm nights, the storms that split on radar, the field edges that yellowed before anyone wanted to speak plainly. They remembered the way July made respectable systems look thinner than they had looked in June. And they remembered the East Bend. The field with cattle on it. The field that looked wrong in May. The field everyone thought Mason had weakened before the season even began. Only July did not expose weakness there. It exposed what the field had been missing. A cornfield does not need to become pasture to learn from it. It does not need nostalgia. It does not need a sermon. It needs functions that modern confidence sometimes strips away and then tries to buy back, one product at a time. Living roots, covered soil, better water entry, cooler surface, biology with a job, enough structure to stay in the fight after the easy moisture is gone. Shelby County had looked at green cover, hoof marks and cattle on corn ground, and decided it was seeing confusion. But the East Bend was not confused. It was breathing. And when July turned the county brittle, the field that everyone called a cow lot still had enough breath left to finish the season.